Zanae Brooks here, and I am talking to Representative Blake Johnson. And wanted to start off, if you could just kind of give us a little bit of background about yourself and then how'd you get to where you are?
Yeah, great. Well, Zade, thanks for having me on. Blake Johnston. I represent District 100 in the legislature, which is portions of downtown Indianapolis all the way out to 465 on the east side. And prior to joining the legislature in 2020, I was a member of the Indianapolis City Council and represented the east side here in the city. I always tell the story that I think I got into public service and politics as a result of my grandparents. My grandmother was a town councilwoman for 28 years. My grandfather was a law enforcement officer, eventually ran for sheriff back in the 70s in Delaware County. And my relationship with them, though, was far after their public service. They lived to their mid 90s. So my entire life, they were pretty old, frankly.
Yeah.
And so they had retired and all of that. But I went every single Sunday to church with them. And from the time as early as I can remember, maybe 4 or 5 years old, they would place me at the front of the church. And my job was to open the door and greet folks and make sure that they felt welcome. And I think honestly, that kind of planted a seed in my head for a long time, even without the kind of explicitness of going into public service, that part of your job as a person is to open doors for people, is to make them feel welcome, to help them see their value. And so kind of every step along the way, I think that's been a prism through which I see everything. So I went to college, then came back to Indiana and taught in the Indianapolis public school system for a couple of years, then spent some time working on campaigns and with candidates that I believed in, worked for Congressman Andre Carson for a couple of years in his official office, and then spent a stint of time, about 5 years, working in higher education public policy, focused specifically on college completion and making sure that we're opening the doors of higher education to as many people as possible. And then once they're there, ensuring they actually graduate with a degree or credential that can allow them to pursue economic stability. And along the way there, some opportunities to run for office, to be on the city council, to find ways to make an impact more directly in public policy came along, and here we are now, where I've been in the legislature for 3 years and have aged 25 years in the process. And I'm happy to be here with you today.
Nice, thank you. My husband is a pastor of a church, and they often say that pastoring is like dog years, and so 1 year is like 7 years.
I believe that. I
Yeah,
believe
it sounds
that.
like legislative can be very similar.
It's true. I'm actually 18 years old, but I look like this. It's very complicated these days.
Awesome. Can you talk a little bit about you are on the local government committee? Can you
Yes,
talk a little
that's
bit
right.
about that?
Yeah, so the local government committee focuses on issues facing cities and towns and counties, right? So whereas a lot of the other committees are thinking about macro level conversations, we're often addressing issues that are brought forth by local municipalities. And having been a city councilor, when I was on the city council, I chaired the administration finance committee. I was placed on that committee, I think, to bring the voice of cities to those discussions. And so we'll sometimes deal with issues around, zoning and taxation and building codes and things like that. But it's also really the forum by which communities can come forward and bring their issues and see if we can find solutions that could apply to the state as a whole. And so I'm often thinking about what we're doing in terms of the state legislature to make life easier for towns and cities, to ensure that we're doing a better job attracting talent, because I think the most important asset any community has are the people that are there, and we've got to do a better job of keeping great people and recruiting new people to join our communities. And so that committee is kind of a place to think about all those things and to ensure that we're doing the best we can to see our communities thrive, which is a challenge in Indiana because the major metros are doing really, really well. Indianapolis is growing. And alongside the donut counties, we accounted for the vast majority of growth in the state, whereas many of our rural communities are bleeding population pretty rapidly. Small towns are struggling with a few exceptions. And I think there's a lot of challenges that we've got to think about as we think about local communities.
Awesome. Thanks for bringing that up. Is there anything that you think the state or government could be doing differently to help our, rural communities?
Yeah, I mean, I think there has to be a better collaborative relationship. And I think right now, what you see in the state house, more so than Democrats versus Republicans, which has gotten, I think, pretty nasty at times, sure, is really an urban and rural divide. And legislators, this is going to sound a little bit like an indictment because it is. Legislators often really lean into that, and I think especially in rural communities, you'll hear these legislators talk about how Indianapolis gets everything, and the investments that we're making here are so, are taking away from what's happening in rural communities. And I'm not saying that there's not some truth to that, but at the end of the day, Marion County is a donor county. When it comes to the amount of tax dollars we bring in, most of it goes to other communities. And in Marion County in particular, even our income tax dollars are usually going to surrounding communities because a lot of folks live in the donut counties, drive into work, utilize our services, our infrastructure, then drive home and take their income tax dollars with them.
Mhm.
So Marion County is giving away a lot of tax dollars that aren't being served into this community. Now, that said, some of the technological innovations that are happening around agriculture, like those are things that can be applied to the urban core. And then things that are happening in urban communities around placemaking and green spaces and thinking about talent attraction and retention could be applied to rural communities. But we have to find a way to bridge that divide and have those conversations in a way that's productive and that doesn't make assumptions about what it means to live in a city versus what it means to live in a rural community. And I have the benefit of having grown up in Daleville, Indiana, right? 2,500 people, a stoplight, and a White Castle. Like that is, that was kind of the extent of it. And I grew up on a farm, right, where my dad had cows and pigs, and then moving to this community, right, and living right downtown. Frankly, they're two very different lifestyles, but we have a lot to learn from one another. We just have to find ways to pursue that dialogue more fervently. Because right now, I think oftentimes in politics, we just decide that it's easier to retreat to our corners of what we care about and not think about putting ourselves in other people's shoes.
For sure. That's a great. And I like that you bring that up because even as I'm going around talking around the state talking to people, and the question is like, well, are you learning more about rural communities? Because I'm from the city. And I'm like, well, at the end of the day, like I talk a lot about like diversifying government and spending and all of that. And not just from a racial standpoint, but rural, urban, men, women, all of that. And what I'm learning is that our folks that live in rural communities want the same things, right? You talk about infrastructure, broadband, access to healthcare, food, all of those same things. But I think sometimes it seems to be polarized and not thought about, in an equitable way. Like everybody needs the same thing. It may just the implementation of that may be a little different.
Well, yeah, and I think there's so many, exterior factors that are playing a role here, right? I mean, I think the way the news covers things at times is really problematic. I think the way we have our own discussions, and I think oftentimes we have conversations all the time, right, about implicit bias as it relates to race, but there are also biases that exist as it relates to geography,
Mhm.
and I think those come in quite a bit. And I have this conversation with my own parents, right, where they are convinced that Indianapolis is incredibly unsafe and I'm always in danger. Anytime I'm going to get a cup of coffee or something, I'm taking my life in my own hands. I'm like, well, that's not actually true. I mean, there's like a media bend towards sensationalism around crime and all of that. And not that there aren't challenges and issues that we have to address, there certainly are. But we're creating kind of narratives around what certain communities are, what they are not. And that detracts from our ability to then collaborate towards solutions. And instead, you're coming in with biases about what those two communities are, not what they can be if we work together. I think that's the more important discussion to be having.
For sure, for sure. Are there specific offices within the state government that you work directly with? Like, I'm not sure if you work with, the auditor or the treasurer, but do you work with like the budget agency or any other agencies closely?
Yeah, I mean, so a lot of my time, so I'm on the Roads and Transportation Committee. So Department of Transportation, obviously, in dot is one that I spend a lot more time with. The local government committee deals with intergovernmental relations and all of that, and the actual governing bodies of local municipalities. And then I'm on the Public Policy Committee, which oversees alcohol laws and some of the kind of macro level policy decisions. But I think more broadly, my career has focused a lot on education, on talent, and so IEDC and other agencies like that are really critically important to me because I'm thinking about, how do we shift from just investing in businesses when we can and should be investing in people. And I think that's kind of got to be the next phase of our economic development, is thinking about what we're doing from a talent standpoint. And why I think that's so important is because I think as Indiana continues to roll out what I see as very regressive policies that make us look even more conservative, we are going to have even greater challenges in terms of talent attraction and retention. And I'll tell you, we can have the most dynamic and wonderful corporate tax rates in the country, but if we don't have the talent to fill jobs, those companies are not going to make their investments here. And the companies who are here are going to struggle to find and keep people, which I think we're already seeing. And it's going to be much, much harder for us to perform and to produce the kind of economic outputs we need to if we're not thinking people first, talent first, skills first, rather than just what our tax structure is to entice new headquarters.
Right. Yeah, I love that. People first. What a novel concept. I think this is great to educate people on what legislators do, how they interact with state government officials, vice versa. My last question, on a little lighter note, you kind of talked about before we started recording how you kind of transition jobs so you can spend more time as a legislator. What is something that you love, like what's kind of made that decision to kind of be more all in? Just kind of talk about, maybe something that's most rewarding for you.
Yeah, Zane, it's tough because the last several weeks in this job have been, I think, particularly trying.
Sure.
And I think the rewarding piece of this is knowing that you're fighting for things that matter and that affect people's everyday lives. I think there's probably some conception, right, that being a legislator is a sweet gig, like
Sure.
that it's just like, you get called by your title and there's all these things about all these trappings. And to an extent, that's true. I mean, it's an extraordinary honor to hold a seat in the House of Representatives. However, like the stakes are really, really high. And, through the conversations about women's rights over the last several weeks, through seeing legislation pass that expanded and made it far easier for people to get guns in our state, when we're already the 12th highest in terms of number of citizens that are licensed to carry weapons. When we see a state that is stockpiling tax dollars just so they can say we've got a huge bucket of reserves rather than investing in our people, those fights really matter. And you are going into battle every single day to try to shift the culture of state government to be more focused on Hoosiers rather than political talking points. And so while I'm sort of deflecting your question here, I think the reward is in knowing that the fights we're undertaking are not trivial. They are about representing the actual voices of people. And I'll say, in both the Senate and the House, we're in the super minority as Democrats. And it makes you feel like the fight is even more important, that there's only so many of us there, and you've got to be taking every shot you can to try to make incremental progress on behalf of the people who entrusted us with the jobs. And so I take quite a bit of reward in being in my own community and hearing from folks. And then I take quite a bit of pride in knowing that when I step to that microphone, I'm carrying the voice of a heck of a lot of people who are relying on me and who are relying on our caucus to be a voice of reason in an otherwise pretty politically tumultuous environment. So I feel like that's a dark answer rather than like a sort of flowery one, but it's the truth. I mean, I've definitely lost some years of my life, I think, in the fight to make us a little bit more of a progressive state and to help communicate that we can be better.
Yeah, thank you for that honest answer. And I think just to wrap things up, I think when we talk about the importance of voting, this is why, right? Because you are in such a super minority. But if more people exercise their right to vote and we're not ranked 46 in voter turnout, maybe we start to even the scales and everything isn't as polarizing, and we do put people first. Do you agree with that?
Absolutely. And, and that number that you shared about where we rank in terms of voter turnout, it also then connects to the fact that on most rankings, we're pretty low on quality of life and these things that are directly impacted by the decisions of government, right? And I think that, I always talk about how the federal government, the presidency, Congress, they get a lot of attention, right? Legislative races don't. And even statewide races like the one you're in, like they don't get the attention they deserve, despite the fact that they have an outsized impact on our lives every single day. I'm a big believer in the value of local government, like how safe you feel, how easy it is to traverse the infrastructure that you drive and walk on, how comfortable you are with your ability to keep a good job and to pursue new opportunities if you so choose. Those are all influenced dramatically by your local and state government. And when we are 46th in terms of turnout, and when 35-40% of our voters that are registered don't show up, the outcome is a government that doesn't fully represent them. And when a government as an infrastructure doesn't fully represent the people, you get legislation that is not aligned with the vast majority of Hoosiers. And I think that's what we're dealing with right now, is that we have pieces of legislation moving forward that the vast majority of Hoosiers don't agree with, but their politicians don't feel accountable to the actual people enough to rein those things in, or to not introduce them in the first place. So a long-winded way of saying, yes, I mean, we have to vote. We have to show up. If you want government to work better and more on your behalf, the only way to do that is to make sure that you're heard when those polls open on November 8th.
Absolutely. Well, thank you for your time.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, hopefully this helps move the needle at least a little bit to get people to understand government, but then to also understand the importance of voting. So, and
Absolutely.
Thank you for all of your service and representing.
Thank you. Well, thanks for stepping up to the plate yourself. We'll see you soon, I'm sure.
All righty. Talk to you later.
Take care.
Bye.